Hello and welcome everyone to another De Gruyter book talk. Today with the esteemed artist and art historian, Professor Doris Sung. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Professor Sung's research focuses on early modern and contemporary art of East Asia, cultural interactions between Asia and Europe, and gender and visual culture. And today we are going to focus, as you can see, on her latest book, Women of Chinese Modern Art, Gender and Reforming Traditions in National and Global Spheres, 1900s to 1930s. The book examines the contribution of female embroiderers and traditionalists, calligraphers and painters to the development of Chinese modern art and cultural diplomacy on the global stage in the 20th century. Again, thank you so much for doing this book talk today. First question today is maybe the most obvious one, is what made you start thinking about the subject? What made you start working on it?
Yeah, thank you, Rabea. And I also want to thank you, your team, and for all your efforts in making this book possible. So I really appreciate that. So how I started this research, yeah, it was an interesting trajectory. I'm sure if you ask any scholars about the research, they will always say that, because it is true, right? There's something sparked in us, and therefore we'll go on to do that. So it started with the research for my doctoral dissertation about 15 years ago. So initially, I was planning on working on contemporary women artists in China, as I saw that there was a significant underrepresentation of female artists, despite the fact that contemporary Chinese art has become such an important presence in the international art world. So therefore, I asked the questions of what feminism or feminist art mean in contemporary China. And in the meantime, at that time, I was researching, I was a research assistant for a digital humanities project focusing on women's magazines published in early 20th century China. So one day I encountered an image of a female embroiderer, this one. Her name was Shen Shou, and her embroidered portrait of the Italian Queen Eleanor. So the photos were published in 1911 in the journal called 妇女时报, or Women's Eastern Times. That really piqued my interest. I think, why would she embroider a portrait of an Italian queen? And that's how I started the journey of finding out who these women were and what they did at the time of the early 20th century. So when I started my research, except a few articles and a master thesis focusing on individual artists, there was a lacuna in the research of modern Chinese history about women artists' contribution. And even though in the past 30 years or so, there has been quite a bit of research on Chinese women writers, educators, and political figures, there is almost nothing about the artists. So especially women artists who were practicing traditional painting and calligraphy, and the embroiderers, since their works were considered to be craft. So they usually remain nameless in history. So I wanted to know more about the story. And in the end, it was very much about finding the past. And then I actually had a lot more understanding of what happened in the contemporary time as well.
I see. So was it difficult to collect primary sources for the project?
Yes, simply it was. And I'm sure that most art historians, if they're dealing with periods that was earlier time and pre-modern and sometimes early modern as well, that it was always difficult, especially about women. Information about them was far and few between. And in the Chinese context, it was partly, because most of the works were not collected. And of course, artworks were ephemeral, and many of the works did not survive the wars throughout the 20th century. And yeah, museums, they tend not to collect any work by women, but some private collectors started to do that. So that's how I was able to find some. And also, unlike many male artists at the time, women generally did not write about their art practice. And so it was difficult to find information about them, nor was it easy to locate their artworks. So I rely very much on the publications of the time, especially the aforementioned women's magazines in which women artists were represented. And also sometimes they will write about their work as well. But not often, but yeah, every now and then I will see articles published by a woman artist and writing about their own art practice. And it was also worth mentioning that there were a group of women artists who practiced Western style art in the 1910s to about 1930s, such as the well-known painter Pan Yuliang. And I'm sure if people research on Chinese art history, they will know who that was. And these artists, the one who practiced Western art, they were when compared to the counterparts, they were more willing to be in the public eyes. And therefore, there is a bit more information about them, especially when quite a few of them went abroad to Japan and Europe to study. So the traditionalists, on the other hand, were not considered to be pioneers for that reason. And they were more reluctant to be engaged in the public spheres. So it took some digging before I realized that some of them, for example, this woman, Wu Xingfen, though she had never been abroad, she had 2 bilingual albums of her works published in Shanghai, as you can see there. And Jin Taotao, this woman, whose work focused on reviving Song Dynasty painting, she had lived in the UK and France on 2 different occasions, which was completely really rare at the time. And she had even published an article in English about her views on women's progress. So once I was able to find out more about their lives, I was able to locate some of their artworks in private collections and a few in museums here and there, but mostly the publications that was published at the time, especially women's journals, were my main source of research material.
That's interesting because the traditional view of Chinese women is often not one that like public facing, right? That
yes.
They are not, or you don't, well, I, for one, and that's maybe my own problem. But yeah, it seems to be that they are not viewed as being out there in the public eye as much, and yet your book highlights their art, and you just said they were international and had all that interaction and international activities. So what brought on these changes?
Yes, that's very true. And not until the 1990s that Susan Mann and Dorothy Cole wrote about the 17th century and 18th century women. Like people had a lot of misunderstanding of how traditional, in the traditional world, how women were, right? Mostly it was because in the early 20th century and later in the 20th century that there was a lot of misunderstanding of how women were in China. But yeah, it started to change, especially at the turn of the 20th century. And only recently people started to really research on that and rethink what it was like for them. So the turn of the 20th century in the late Qing, and it was very corrupted, right? The regime was very corrupted, and then the dynasty was on the verge of collapsing. So it was facing many internal and external crises. And the reformists at the time, including Liang Qichao, Cai Yuanpei, they were thinking about the woman question, about what women should learn and to what ends, and how they could contribute to the society. So yes, they were blaming China's weakness partly on the lack of education of women, but we know that it was not true, right? There's a lot of revisionist view on that. But this led to an opportunity for women to engage in the public sphere. One of the pivotal moments came when the late Qing government sanctioned a public education for women in 1907. Although women were educated in their homes in the past, there was no formal public education for them until that time. So the curriculum of this new education emphasized the importance of practical learning for women so that they could use the skills to make a living. These practical skills, including tailoring, embroidery, lace making, and basic painting and drawing. So the curriculum gave rise to the preservation, promotion, and education of traditionalist art forms, as well as what we call 女工, or women's handiwork, in a more formal and systematic way. So furthermore, the Lei Qing government and the newly established republic after the 1911 revolution, they were eager to engage in the global cultural stage. So the Qing started to participate in World's Fair in the mid-19th century. And in the climate of global competition for cultural supremacy, both the Lei Qing and later the Republican government started to rethink about China's cultural position in the world. So the notion of 国画, or national painting, was also coined at the time to denote and distinguish the traditional art form from the nascent Western visual idiom coming into China. So that was when embroidery was showcased as important cultural heritage in these international venues. And Shen Shou, the woman I just talked about, the embroiderer, she harnessed the opportunity and reformed the subject matter and techniques of embroidery. Not only did she embroider a portrait of Italian Queen Eleanor, but she later did this work based on an oil painting of Jesus Christ by Italian Baroque artist Reni. Yeah, it seems very random, but it's actually making a lot of sense if we look at the whole picture, cultural context at the time. So the embroidery was shown at the Panama Pacific International Expo in San Francisco in 1915. And the two artists that I just mentioned, Wu Xingfen and Jin Taotao, they also had the work shown in Japan, Belgium, France, and as far as Australia. These stories are just fascinating. And that's how I get started and think about their international engagement as well.
Yeah, it truly is inspiring as well, because it sounds like, and the photo before of the classroom full of girls, that I find that amazing. I can't stop looking at it, because it seems to push a feminist agenda even, right? As if like we know that education plays a huge role in feminism globally, but would you agree and say that art history specifically is an important tool to push that agenda?
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. While I was writing the book, I consistently imagined what it was like for these women, right? Going against a very patriarchal society and a largely male-centric art world, especially the traditionalist art world, painting and calligraphy in the Chinese style. And yet, in the subtle ways, they started to change how they were represented and the ways they participated in society. So not only did they really were engaging in the art world, but they were very out there. They were, I would say, some of them were public intellectuals, if we use that term. So their works sometimes were deemed to be more traditional, but they were important actors in the revaluation of Chinese cultural heritage in the world at the time. And I think they deserve to be discussed through a feminist discourse. Now, it would be easy if we look at some other artists at the time, especially the ones who practiced Western style art, because of the subject matters. They were painting nude and they were painting subjects that was not traditional, right? Seemed to be not traditional. So it was more easy for us to look at these work as from a more feminist angle. But I think this woman, the traditionalists, they were really in various ways changing the world. So yes, I definitely would say that they were the feminists.
And it also sounds like, even though you obviously focus in the book and it's in the title on Chinese women artists, like a global transnational thing. So would you see the study as an engagement with current global dialogue on feminism and art even?
Yeah, definitely. And In the same way as I just mentioned, they deserve to be discussed through a feminist discourse, right? So there has been a lot more research on Euro-American artists in recent years on their contribution to the development of modern and contemporary art. And yet very little is known about non-Euro-American women artists. So I see this book as a small contribution to this global dialogue. So for example, Shen Shou and Jin Taotao's work were shown at the Australian Exhibition of Women's Work in 1907. Yeah, it really blew my mind when I found that information, right, in Australia. I imagine what the viewers thought about their works at the time, right? And what the British, the Australian thought about the Chinese woman's work. And were they in awe with Shen Shou's embroidery, or did they just ignore them because they just simply had no interest in these exotic works? So yeah, I've been trying to really find about the reactions as well and how this engagement changed in Australian art or even in British art as well. So these stories actually happen in history, and I think they deserve more than just a footnote.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight that like for Westerners looking at even contemporaries of that time, you think of painting and maybe playing the piano and singing. That's typical female activities when you don't know what to do, right? Leisure time activities. But then you turn into women artists, and then it's work, and then it becomes a whole different topic. So that's yeah, very, very fascinating, I think. Did you have pushback from the more traditional scholars of Chinese art history about how you framed your project and book?
Actually, I have been getting a lot of support instead of any pushback. And I think in terms of Chinese history or even the whole art history field, has been quite a change in recent years. So feminist angle has become, or gender angles has become a very important discourse in art history and in Chinese art history as well. So in fact, I received very positive encouragement from some very respected scholars in the field, as they see this as a paradigm shift when we see or move our lens away from the dominant and the known narratives. So I feel very lucky, as these scholars have provided a solid foundation of the history of Chinese modern art on which I can build my project.
That's always so nice to hear, the support of the academic community.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And because you already mentioned it, you basically gave the keyword just now. The book does contribute to the discourse of modern gender history, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, it does. So absolutely, yes. There is very little on women artists, and yes, they were an integral part of women's rights movement in China at the turn of the 20th century. So for example, in part 3 of the book, I talk about this group, 中国女子书画会, or the Women's Society of Calligraphy and Painting. So this group of artists joined forces just before the Second Sino-Japanese War in the 1930s. Their contribution had gone beyond activities in the art world. So they were very much like a charity organization. So they would be collecting money through selling their artworks, and they consistently held charity events for the war efforts. So many of them work with other women and political activists as well. So in many ways, I see that they had a lot of connections with other writers, political activists. So for example, one of the women in the group was He Xiangying, and I'm sure most people who research on modern history in China will know who that was. So she was a revolutionary, and so she was also a painter, and so she was the doyen of this group as well. So I see my book as giving a more holistic and integral picture of what happened in late 19th and early 20th century China as well.
Right, yeah. It has a rather personal note for yourself too, because I know you were a practicing artist before you became an academic, an art historian. What made you decide to go into academia?
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing for me because I did my BFA and then I did my MFA both in studio art. And then I was so determined that I'm going to be an artist, having exhibitions and all that. But when I was doing my MFA, I got very interested in research. So as I mentioned, I started to look at contemporary art in China, but then eventually I moved back with just some of the more interesting idea about where did they come from, right? Or how did contemporary Chinese art become what it is today? So I decided to go on and work on a PhD. So initially, I thought I could continue my art practice while doing this, but yeah, as most people know, it was almost impossible to do two things with academia and another art practice as well. But then eventually I see that my research as a very creative process. I still think of research as like a painting process. At some point, all the pieces come together, and in my own vocabulary, they start to gel, right? Just like the multiple layer of translucent varnish, sometimes I put on my paintings, and they became a holistic entity, just like how this book has come about.
That's a beautiful metaphor.
Thank you.
I have one last question for you, and that is, do you have any advice for early career or young scholars for how to go about breaking into academia in China or everywhere else in the world?
Yeah, well, that is a very difficult thing these days, as we know that it's becoming harder and harder to get any tenure track position. But I think the most important thing is someone really passionate about what they do, right? So if it cannot be sustained, it is a very difficult path. So I went through being an artist, and then I also worked in a museum, and then eventually get a tenure track position. Yeah, and while teaching and doing all the administration, you're expected to produce a book and publish, right? So it is never an easy path, but I think this is a beautiful thing if one can really sustain the interest. And of course, nowadays, we really need to go through the whole education, right? Getting a PhD in order to be able to do that. And in the meantime, just while studying, I think getting out there, right, participating in conferences and also connecting with scholars is the most important thing. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I agree very much. Like passion and determination seems to be what also combines both fields, maybe. But yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think the museum work really gave me a whole different perspective as well of how I approach my research.
Yeah, that absolutely. The more interdisciplinary you can bring into the whole thing, the better. One can only benefit from working with each other, always.
Definitely.
Thank you so much, Doris.
Right. Thank you, Rabea.
Fascinating talk. Everybody, look at that beautiful cover. You have seen the beautiful pictures, some of the beautiful. There are so many more amazing pictures in this book and images. And please look at it wherever you can find it, and don't miss the opportunity. It's amazing. Thank you, and it's fascinating. The reading it is truly fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, I also wanted to thank the funders, right? Jiang Jingguo Foundation and the CAA College Art Association, Metropolitan Center for the Study of Far Eastern Art, and also CCAT as well. So they provided funding for the production of this book. So I'm greatly appreciated that. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, very, very important.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabea.
Well, thank you, and thank you for everybody who listened to this talk. I hope you find reading more about this topic as fascinating and interesting as we do. And we'll hopefully see you soon for the next book talk.
Thank you.